Good. She just told me the mic wasn't on. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. If you have a cell phone, and you please turn it off at this time, or put it on whatever you do, whatever you kids do. This Thursday evening, People's University Yoga continues. Our class 3 will be yoga and music with Nicole Snodgrass. And if you have a mat, we ask that you bring the mat. And I have announced a new project as of yesterday. Some people were just laughing at me for attempting this, but we're going to read the book Ulysses by James Joyce. And we'll have a book club that will meet once a month. February, March, April, May, and then in June we'll have Bloomsday, which is, so Ulysses, if you don't know, he walks Leopold Bloom the entire length of Dublin, Ireland, and so they reenact that walk in Dublin, Ireland, and we're going to do it here in Wheeling, only virtually, and because we're not in Dublin, Ireland. And I can't fly you there, but we will have an expert. His name is Patrick Hastings. He's an English professor, and he did a whole website, which is called A Guide to Ulysses. I recommend it highly. And he'll take us through it all. And then we'll talk about the book. So if you're interested in that, just let me know, or go online and you can sign up by email or whatever. Next week, we did our literary pub crawl last summer. And we'll be reenacting it here without any pub stuff. Just 4 giants of Wheeling literature: Rebecca Harding Davis, James McHenry Jones, Davis Grubb, and James Wright, as interpreted by Christina Fizanik, Ron Scott Jr., and Vince Marshall. Don't miss it, it's really good. And then on the 20th, the Ann Thomas Memorial Lecture will feature Alvin Hall. His book is called Driving the Green Book. So he sort of drove the course of the Green Book, which was a guide for African Americans during Jim Crow for safe places to stay and to eat where they were welcome. And so he wrote a book about it, which I've read, and it's excellent. And he'll be here on the 20th. So this is our first program for Black History Month. And our friend Pete Chacalos is back. He's a graduate of Wheeling Park High School, WVU, and Ohio University. He retired after 35 years of teaching, and he was a national board certified teacher and was named as Wheeling Area Chamber of Commerce Teacher of the Year for 2018-2019. He specializes in Civil War history and is vice president of the Ohio Valley Civil War Roundtable, serves on the West Virginia Independence Hall Foundation Board, and was recognized as a West Virginia History Hero for 2022. He lives in Wheeling with his wife, Lynette, and his golden doodle, Abby. His new book, which you see up here, is called They All Became Heroes, the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Infantry. Here is Peter Chacalos.
I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Those were the words of famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. He settled in 1830 in Boston, began his abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, and those words were emblazoned on the very first page of the very first issue of The Liberator. Now, Garrison was very critical of Boston's moral compass. He thought that there was a higher law that superseded any laws that governed slavery. And Bostonians at that time were very apathetic about that. And Garrison set out to change that. It's something that he could not accept. In 1830, Boston's population was about 60,000. 2,000 was the black population. Now, it was rather small compared to the overall population of Boston, but it was very well organized, and churches were at its center. What you see on the screen is the actual building, the First African Baptist Church, which was referred to as the African Meeting House. That played a great role in all the activities of the Black community of Boston. There were, as the years went on, even though the Black population were free, they were discriminated against at every twist and turn. And as time went by, there were a number of events which were devastating to the Black community. I'll just briefly go through some of those. And as you see on the screen, you see a little number in the lower left-hand corner. That'll correspond to whatever chapter in the book that is covered in. First was the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, seen here in the picture on the left, is arguing he proposed an omnibus bill. And here he's seen arguing it in Congress. Well, he wasn't in great health, and he soon became too sick to argue that in Congress. So Stephen Douglas took up the mantle. He had been going behind the scenes previously because he knew that there's no way the omnibus bill would pass. So he was gathering support for each individual part of the bill. When he took center stage, he started to get each individual bill passed separately. To make a long story short, the North wanted things, the South wanted things. So there was a compromise that was reached. That's the Compromise of 1850. The main thing that the North got that they wanted was the admission of California as a free state. Now, what this did is it swung the balance of power to the free states. The South got a very strong and strengthened fugitive slave law. And what this did was it harnessed the power of the federal government to capture and return slaves that had escaped the South back to their owners. That wasn't very successful overall. Only a little bit over 300 people were returned. The very last slave that was prosecuted under the fugitive slave law was captured in Cleveland and returned to, her name was Sarah Lucinda Bagby. She was returned to her owner in the Northern Virginia town of Wheeling. So that was one strike against the Black community. Next came the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. As you can see, California is off all by itself, and there was a proposition for a transcontinental railroad. Of course, the northern interests wanted it to take a northern route, southern interests wanted it to take a southern route. Enter our good friend Stephen Douglas. He was a proponent of the transcontinental railroad, and he wanted it to run through his home state of Illinois, and he wanted the eastern end of it to begin in Chicago. But to do that, he needed southern votes. So he proposed organizing the Kansas and Nebraska territories, and he promised the Southerners that he would insert a clause in his bill that would repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820. What the Missouri Compromise had done, it had established the 3630 parallel, the southern border of Missouri, going all the way across the country, as the dividing line between the free states and the slave states. If that was repealed, that would open the western territories to slavery. through the idea of popular sovereignty. Every state would decide for itself whether or not it would permit slavery. So the act in itself, let me tell you one thing about Stephen Douglas before I go on. Stephen Douglas had invested very heavily in Chicago real estate. He stood to profit very handsomely if that railroad began in Chicago. So he might have had ulterior motives. Next, came the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott had been born into slavery. At one point, he was sold to a U.S. Army surgeon named John Emerson. He traveled with Emerson throughout his various postings, mostly in the north and mostly at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. Dr. Emerson ended up getting married, and when he died, Dred Scott became property of
his wife. Well, she returned back to Missouri in the South. Dred Scott sued for his freedom on the basis that he lived most of his life in the North, and since that was free and banned slavery, that should be forever free. Well, that began a 7-year saga that went through the court system. Ended up in 1857, the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott by a vote of 7-2. Now, the two justices, Benjamin Curtis and John McLean, were the only two justices that voted in Dred Scott's favor. They were also the only two Republicans on the Supreme Court. The other 7 were all Southerners, and 5 of them were slaveholders. Dred Scott never stood a chance under those circumstances. And let me just say that John McLean is not the same John McLean who threw Hans Ruper off top of Nakatomi Tower on Christmas Eve. The majority opinion was written by Justice Roger Taney, and he had some very convoluted thinking. And I won't bother to go through everything that he wrote, but I will show you these 2 things. He wrote against Dred Scott because Dred Scott did not have the right to bring a federal suit. Why? Because that right belonged only to citizens of the United States, and he said that blacks were not citizens. Another strike against the black community. Justice Breyer, retired Justice Breyer, had been quoted as saying that that's the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made. Back in Boston, the winds of war are brewing. John Brown has been executed after his failed attempt at Harper's Ferry. The black community was in mourning on December the 2nd of 1859. That's the day that John Brown was hanged. They were also in mourning on the anniversary of his death. And at that point, a lot of mob violence plagued Boston. Roving gangs, mostly of Irish, would cause all kinds of trouble. And then secession began. First by South Carolina, right before Christmas, and followed by Mississippi. And on April the 12th of 1861, Fort Sumter was fired on. It was bombarded for 36 hours. On the 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down a rebellion. Boston's blacks volunteered to fight. Despite everything that they had been through, everything that went against them, they still volunteered to fight, but they were turned away because of a 1792 law that prohibited blacks from enlisting in the Army. Now, make no mistake about it, the South was fighting to preserve slavery. The Northern men who volunteered, however, did not volunteer to end slavery. They volunteered to preserve the Union. President Lincoln, in a letter to Horace Greeley, had said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." And that is exactly what he did. President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. Just a little sidebar here. You know what he signed the night before? Anybody? Very good, the West Virginia Statehood Bill. So once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that opened the door for African Americans to enlist in the Army. So Governor John Andrew took center stage. He wanted to raise a black regiment in Massachusetts. So he journeyed to Washington and met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was from? Very good. So he came away with an order, which I just want to read what I have highlighted in yellow. The Governor Andrew of Massachusetts is authorized until further orders, that was a key point, to raise such number of volunteers, and may include persons of African descent organized into special corps. Now, there was still very strong resistance to recruiting African Americans. And Governor Andrew was anxious to raise that regiment. So after getting the okay from Stanton, the only thing, by the way, that the War Department would not do, it would not commission black officers. Any units would have to be commanded by white officers. So Governor Andrew wrote a letter to Francis Shaw in Boston. He told him his plans, what he wanted to do, and he told him he wanted to appoint his son, Francis Shaw's son, Robert Gould Shaw, to be the colonel of the 54th. And he was going to appoint Edward Hallowed to be the lieutenant colonel of the 54th. So in the letter he sent to Mr. Shaw, he included another letter for Shaw to deliver to his son Robert, offering him command of the 54th. Mr. Shaw took the letter in person to his son, and son read it, and he at first refused the offer. But after a couple of days he had second thoughts, and he relented and accepted the offer, probably to please his parents, but especially to please his mother. So Robert Gould Shaw, you see pictured here, he was born in a lap of luxury. He traveled extensively with his parents as a young man. He had the best of everything. Traveled extensively through Europe. He went to the best schools. He had commanded troops. He was fought in the Battle of Cedar Mountain. He fought at the Battle of Antietam. Robert Gould Shaw checked all the boxes that Governor Andrew was looking for. So he had his commander and his lieutenant commander. Now, one thing about recruiting had to begin, but it's important to note that the population of Massachusetts could not support enough men to form a whole regiment, so they had to begin recruiting. And the first person that was selected for a commission in the 54th was the name you see here, John W. Appleton. He set up a recruiting office in Boston, put these posters all over the place, The men here recruited would become Company A of the 54th. The same thing occurred at various other cities and filled the companies B, C, and D. But they still needed more men. And they were getting a lot of requests for commissions. So the commissioned officers, the people who were requesting commissions, they needed moral courage because they were going to be made fun of. They wouldn't hear the end of it. How dare you command black soldiers? They won't fight. They'll run at the first sign of the enemy. They won't understand their orders, the bugle calls or the drums. But men still wanted commissions. They also needed physical courage because of an act that the Confederate Congress had passed. I'm going to read just the parts I have highlighted, that every white person being a commissioned officer or acting as such, who during the present war shall command Negroes, if captured, will be put to death or be otherwise placed at the discretion of the court. President Lincoln established a commission to oversee the raising of recruits to fill the quota of the 54th. George Luther Stearns played the biggest part, as the most successful recruiter that was part of that commission. He established a line of recruiting posts from Boston to St. Louis. His efforts were so successful that the 54th was filled very quickly, but men still kept coming in. With the overflow, it began a sister regiment, which was called the 55th Massachusetts. The 54th, it was decided would train at Reedville, Massachusetts, which is near Boston, at a place called Camp Meigs. Every day, people came to watch the unique sight of the black troops training to go into battle. After only a few weeks, Colonel Shaw was greatly impressed by the men under his command. He wrote home to his mother, "There is not the least doubt that we shall leave this state with as good a regiment as any that has marched." The 54th departed Reedville on May the 28th, took the train to Boston. They marched through the streets to great fanfare. Thousands and thousands of people went to see them off. They eventually went to the Boston Common, where they were in parade, did some drills, and they went to Battery Wharf, boarded ships, and headed for South Carolina. They arrived on June the 3rd in Beaufort, South Carolina, but for a number of days, all they did was fatigue work. Basically manual labor. Digging ditches, unloading ships, so on and so forth. But that's not what Shaw had signed up for. So he requested some action. So he was assigned to an expedition commanded by Colonel Montgomery to Darien, Georgia. They went along the Georgia coast, traveled up the Altamaha River until they reached the small town of Darien. When they got there, it was completely deserted except for 2 women. So they got off their transports, formed in the town square, and Colonel Montgomery's first order was to loot the town. Anything and everything that wasn't nailed down that they could use, they took. There was even one soldier who came by that had a brace of chickens in one arm, and he was holding a rope in the other. And there was a cow at the end of that rope. The next order horrified Colonel Shaw. Montgomery ordered that the town be burned. And he said it with this, he had to follow orders. He expressed his concerns. Colonel Montgomery said he would take it all upon his own shoulders. So they fired the town. Only thing that remained was the church and a few buildings. And the flames could be seen 15 miles away. Now, Shaw later found out that General David Hunter had okayed all of that. But regardless, Hunter was replaced by General Quincy Gilmore. Now, if you look at this map, you notice where Charleston is. That was the ultimate goal, to take Charleston. In order to take Charleston, they first had to take Fort Sumter, which guarded the mouth of Charleston Harbor. In order to take Fort Sumter, they had to take Fort Wagner. In order to take Fort Wagner, they had to take Morris Island, which you see there on the right. So, at that point, General Quincy Gilmore was command of the Department of the South. He devised a plan. He sent troops up the Stony River, which you see in the lower left-hand corner, to threaten the railroad. He also sent General Alfred Terry with a brigade, which included the 54th, to James Island. All this was to draw Confederates away from Morris. And the plan worked. They drew them away from Morris. The 54th camped on James Island on July 11th. That same day, later on, troops landed on Morris Island and went up to Fort Wagner, which is almost near the tip. It's the second little red dot down from the top. I forgot my pointer, else I pointed out to you. And the Federals were thrashed, utterly and completely thrashed. Meanwhile, on James Island, the 54th was camped. On the morning of July 16th, the 54th, along with a few other regiments, the 10th Connecticut, the 104th Pennsylvania, were on picket duty when suddenly they were attacked by five infantry brigades of Confederates. Now, the 54th, you see the set of blue in the front there. Furthest to the left, that's where the 54th was. Oh, thank you. 54th is right here. 54th is right here. And the 10th Connecticut is right there. Now, they weren't the Confederates attacked. And you know what the 54th didn't do? They didn't run. They stood and they fought. But they were so outnumbered that all of the regiments had to retreat. As they were retreating, they see, the 54th does, that the Connecticut regiment is about to get cut off, completely captured. So what did they do? They stopped their retreat, the 54th did, they formed a line, they fought. They fought a delaying action which gave the Connecticut regiment time to escape harm's way. That was the 54th's first fight. A reporter wrote after a couple of days, and I'll read this whole thing here, the boys of the 10th Connecticut could not help loving the men who saved them from destruction. I've been deeply affected at hearing this feeling expressed by officers and men of the Connecticut Regiment, and probably 1,000 homes from Wyndham to Fairfield have in letters been told the story of how the dark-skinned heroes fought the good fight and covered with their own brave hearts the retreat of brothers, sons, and fathers of Connecticut. The total casualty count of the 54th on that day was 45, including 14 killed and 18 wounded. And there were 13 missing. That night, as they were eating, Colonel Shaw confided to Lieutenant Colonel Hallowed that Shaw thought he would not survive the next fight. And how prophetic that would be. Now, that night, again, later on, they were ordered to evacuate James Island. Their goal was to head to Morris Island. Dreary weather, raining all day. It took them almost a whole day to march to that point right there, right off of Lighthouse Inlet, and there they waited for transports to take them across to Morris Island. Finally, transports came. They arrived on Morris Island at 5 o'clock on July the 18th. This was their goal, Fort Wagner, although they didn't know it at the time. Fort Wagner, as you can see, is not your typical fort. It is constructed basically of sand, coarse sand, turf and palmetto logs. You can see the spiked logs in the front. And inside those logs, between those logs and the fort, is a moat. And that moat filled with water when the tide came in. And it rose about 30 feet above the level of the beach. If you look at this diagram, Fort Wagner, the left or the western face is bordered by Vincent's Creek. The back faces Charleston Harbor. The east is the Atlantic Ocean. There's only one possible way to assault Fort Wagner. That's a direct frontal assault. And in the Civil War, those didn't usually work very well. Just ask George Pickett. So, when they landed on Morris Island, Colonel Shaw immediately went to see General George Crockett Strong. And Strong said to him, "You may leave the column if you say yes. Your men, I know, are worn out, but do as you choose." So he was giving him an out. Shaw was not about to take that out. He sent for the 54th to come forward. The 54th, the attacking column would consist of 600 men and 22 officers. Then, when the 54th came up, General Strong addressed the troops. And let me just read what I highlighted in yellow. There are but 300 behind those walls. Don't fire a musket on the way up, but go in and bayonet them at their guns. One little thing wrong with that. He was off a little bit on his estimation of the Confederate strength. It wasn't 300, it was 1,700. So the assault began about 7:45. It was getting dark. Colonel Shaw led the entire way. As you can see, right here, as they are approaching, the available ground is narrow. And some of the men even had to march through the Atlantic Ocean on the assault. When they got about 200 yards from Wagner, they started receiving fire. You know what they didn't do? They didn't turn and run. They closed ranks and they continued on. And Colonel Shaw led the way from start to finish. He gained the rampart, held up his sword, and yelled "Forward, 54th." He was immediately hit multiple times and killed instantly. You know what the 54th hadn't done up to this point? They had not fired a single shot. They had obeyed orders. But now all that broke loose. Pistol fire, gunfire, hand-to-hand combat. When Colonel Shaw was hit and went down, the color bearer was hit also, and the flag started to fall. One sergeant who was coming up from the back saw that flag going down, so he threw down his rifle. Hear what I said? He threw down his rifle in the middle of a battle. And he grabbed that flag. Excuse me. And he planted that flag on the parapet. There was intense hand-to-hand combat. The supporting units that were supposed to come could not get there in time. The 54th, so outnumbered, had to retreat. They retreated to a point about 700 yards from Wagner under the command of Captain Louis Emilio. Now, Captain Emilio was the 9th captain in line to assume command, which meant that the 8 who outranked him had either been killed or wounded. Now let's go back to the sergeant who grabbed those colors. In the retreat, he took those colors off the field. He had already been wounded. As he's carrying those colors off the field, and by colors I mean the flag, he was wounded twice more. He crawled part of the way on his hands and knees. He eventually made it back to the line established by the 54th. In all that time that he carried the flag, never touched the ground, not one single time. That was Sergeant William S. Carney. William H. Carney. This is Sergeant Carney about 3 months later. Recovering from his wounds, you notice he's supporting himself with a cane, and he's holding the flag that he carried from Wagner. And if you could look closely enough, that flag is stained with his blood. This is Sergeant Carney about 30 years later. And I call your attention to this. I'm sure most of you noticed that that is a Congressional Medal of Honor. His citation reads, when the color sergeant was shot down, this soldier grasped the flag, led the way to the parapet, and planted the colors thereon. When the troops fell back, he brought off the flag under a fierce fire in which he was twice severely wounded. Sergeant William H. Carney is the first African American to ever be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's a name that everybody needs to know. What happened afterwards, as you can see, Union casualties over 1,500, Confederate casualties 181. The 54th suffered a 46% casualty rate. The troops which followed in the assault didn't fare much better. But what about Colonel Shaw? What happened to him? Except for his undergarments, his body was completely stripped and all his belongings taken as souvenirs. And then he was thrown in the ditch with his men in a mass grave. Now this was meant as an insult, to bury a white officer with his black troops. Later on, after the Federals had taken Fort Wagner, an effort was made to locate Colonel Shaw's body. His father would not hear of it. He did not want his son's final resting place disturbed. He felt the most holiest place it would be was with the men he served with, the men he died with. Now, his sword was found years later, a few years later, and it was sent north to Colonel Shaw's family. Then it disappeared for many years. It was found only recently in an attic in Massachusetts by descendants of Shaw's sister. And that is the picture there, is the sword that Colonel Shaw carried at Fort Wagner. Now, everybody has seen glory and And all it talks about was the
That was
54th.
the 54th.
Everybody forgets about the 55th. As I said earlier, the 55th was begun with the overflow of recruits that came in for the 54th. The 55th was commanded by Colonel Norwood P. Hallowed, known as Penn. He was originally the lieutenant colonel of the 54th. When the 55th was started, he was transferred to command the 55th, as was Colonel Alfred S. Hartwell, who was originally slated for duty with the 54th. He became the lieutenant colonel of the 55th. And they went through the same procedures, the same training that the 54th went through. The thing about the 55th, Massachusetts, you know how many people from Massachusetts were in that regiment? 22. Most of the men in that regiment were from Ohio, and that number 222. So they received their colors. They left Reedville on May the 28th, and when the 54th left Reedville on the 28th, the 55th took over their barracks and again began their training much the same as they had, the 54th had. Now, they finally received the presentation of their colors on July the 18th. The same day they received their colors, the 54th was fighting at Fort Wagner. On July 21st, they broke camp, marched to the railroad depot, went to Boston just like the 54th did. But due to inclement weather, it was kind of not a real big parade or anything. They marched straight to the wharf and headed for war. They were assigned to Brigadier General Alfred A. Wild's African Brigade. Now, they arrived in South Carolina, and they, along with the 54th, were involved in the siege of Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner hadn't been taken yet, so again, the 54th and the 55th did fatigue duty, digging ditches. What they would do is they dug a series of zigzagging ditches that would approach Fort Wagner, which would make it simpler for them to launch an attack and take the fort. So they were involved in that. They were also involved in Grand Guard duty and so on. Now, what you see here in the picture is one of those areas that they had dug out and placed shelters for to protect them from fire that they would receive from Wagner, and they did receive fire the whole way. Now, on September 5th, Wagner was shelled unmercifully. September 7th, the Confederates abandoned Wagner, and on September the 8th, the Federals moved in. And immediately there was an assault on Fort Sumter, which was a complete disaster. Fort Sumter would not be taken until Charleston fell. Now, the pacing effort, the original broadsides that were sent out, let me call your attention to this. The men were promised $13 a month. When they lined up for the first pay, they found out that their pay would be $10 a month. And out of that $10, $3 would be withheld as a clothing allowance. So in essence, they're getting $7 a month, half of what white soldiers were getting. They weren't too thrilled about that. The men, including officers, refused pay, and they will continue to refuse pay. Governor Andrew made an offer. The legislature of Massachusetts would cover that $7, so they would get their $13. They refused. They wanted to pay their entire pay to come from the United States government. One soldier of the 55th wrote, "Rather than disgrace us and those whose interests we come to advocate and defend, we will serve our term of 3 years without pay." They weren't going to go away. They were still going to fight. They weren't going to accept pay. Well, in June, almost 18 months after the 54th had begun their enlistments, an equal pay bill was passed through the House and the Senate, and the pay was equalized, and the men of the 54th got their pay retroactive to the point where they had enlisted. Finally. Now, at that point, the duty on Morris Island consisted of shelling Charleston and shelling Fort Sumter. And the picture you see is Fort Sumter as it had been shelled. Rubble. But that actually was kind of good for them because it created a barricade for any future attacks against Sumter, which again never happened. The 54th and 55th were then assigned to an expedition in Florida under the command of General Quincy Gilmore. That is not Quincy Gilmore. I don't know what happened there. That is General Truman Seymour. The command was General, again, Gilmore. And the reason for the Florida expedition, as you can see written up on the screen here, let me just skip to the bottom part, to restore Florida to the Union. If they could get enough people in Florida to sign an oath of loyalty, and President Lincoln's, one of his secretaries, John Hay, had accompanied the expedition, they could bring Florida back into the Union if 10% had signed loyalty oaths. Then Florida could vote for President Lincoln in the upcoming elections of 1864. Well, that never happened. He never really needed those anyway. So, General Gilmore is supposed to be on the left. I don't know how that happened. It wasn't like that this morning for some reason. But they met at Jacksonville on February the 14th. After they conferred, General Gilmore left and went to Hilton Head. And he had written in his later reports, "I consider it well understood at the time between General Seymour and myself that no advance would be made without further instructions from me." Well, guess what General Seymour did? He disobeyed orders in advance. That led to the Battle of the Lusty. So they're in Jacksonville, which is over here on screen, and they were to proceed and cut off or destroy the railroad bridge over the Suwannee River. That's what Seymour's goal. Seymour's goal was. Well, General Seymour didn't anticipate that the Confederates knew he was coming. Confederate General Finnegan set a trap in the only area, the very narrow corridor of dry land that's surrounded by swamps. He sent out his cavalry to skirmish with the Federals that were advancing to draw them into the trap. Well, that was successful. And they were lured into the trap. General Seymour fed his troops in, his units in one at a time, and he finally found that the day was lost. They could not win the battle, so he sent for the final remaining reserves. That was Colonel Montgomery's brigade, which included the 54th. The 54th came forward as other troops were retreating, so they passed each other. Got to the front, the 54th got to the front, had a line up, and had a delayed action, returning fire against the Confederates. They had to retreat. They retreated 200 yards. They had 9 loud cheers, which made the Confederates think that they had gotten reinforcements. They fired a shot. They fired another volley. They retreated 200 yards. They fired another volley. This happened until they got back to the line that had been established. Now these slides are kind of messed up a little bit for some reason. So as they were retreating, the train that was carrying the wounded broke down. The locomotive broke down. This picture should be a full-length picture, but for some reason it's not. It broke down, so the 54th was sent to meet that train. They attached ropes to that train, and the 54th pulled that train for 3 miles until their manpower was replaced by horsepower. Well, where was the 55th? The 55th was at a point called Baldwin, and there was a crossroads there, and on the advance, they were to stay at Baldwin and guard that crossroads. They did not participate actually in the actual battle. Federal casualties amounted to 1,861. Which was 34%, and the Confederate casualties slightly less at 18%. The 54th returned to South Carolina, and at that point, the forces were commanded by General Alexander Schimmelpfennig. And if you know anything about Gettysburg, you heard of General Schimmelpfennig. So as they returned to South Carolina, General Schimmelpfennig embarked on a 3-pronged movement against the enemy. And he had one force that included the 55th, which marched on James Island. So we'll talk about just that part of it. The 55th. The 55th was placed in a position where they would not receive fire. He didn't know how they would react. Well, guess what? They received fire from an artillery battery. And what did they do? They charged the battery. And guess what? They captured it. They captured 2 12-pound Napoleons, and those Napoleons set in front of their camp as trophies. So that was their first fight. And they had some casualties, 29, including 7 killed and 2 mortally wounded. But they fought, and they fought ferociously. The siege of Charleston, as that occurred, the 55th and the 54th, fatigue work, guard duty, and drill work. Didn't do much of anything else. Then on November 23rd, they both received orders to be ready to move at a moment's notice. They were on a mission to disable the railroads in South Carolina, because at that time, General Sherman was advancing on Savannah. Well, their goal was to disrupt the railroad at Granville. Well, a couple of things happened. They got lost twice. Had they not got lost twice, even if they only got lost once, the outcome of this probably would have been different. But as they advanced, they came to a rise where the Confederates had set up a defensive position, a very good defensive position on the little rise known as Honey Hill. Reinforcements arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. Colonel Hartwell's brigade arrived at 9:15. So the Confederates reinforcements got there just in time. And at 11 o'clock, the lead elements of the Federal force reached Honey Hill. Battle ensued. Colonel Hartwell of the 55th commanded the left-hand column, consisting of the 54th and the 55th. They were forced back twice. The third time, Colonel Hartwell led the charge on horseback. Not a good idea. His horse was hit, and he fell. The horse fell on top of Colonel Hartwell. They managed to pull him away, and as he was being pulled away, he was hit twice. He was out of the fight. He would recover, however. So as the battle raged, neither side had a clear advantage. About 2 o'clock, battle started to ebb. The Federals did not renew the attack. The Confederates chose not to pursue. In that battle, Corporal Andrew Jackson Smith, and you read what is highlighted, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor as well, distinguished himself on 30 November 1864 by saving his regimental colors after the color bearer was killed during a bloody charge at the Battle of Honey Hill. So the battle fell on December 21st. General Sherman entered the city. On New Year's Day, just 10 days later, 11 days later actually, 55th was ordered to Savannah for garrison duty. They stayed there until February, and they were ordered to Hilton. Now, Charleston fell on February 21st, 1865, with Company G at the front. The 55th led the way into Charleston. Quite appropriate for a regiment of colored troops to lead the way into the city. At the beginning of April, Brigadier General Edwin Potter led a raid into South Carolina to disable the railroads there again. You'll notice the date that there was an old skirmish called the Battle of Wickens Mill. You'll notice the date, April the 18th, 1865. A few things have already happened. Lee has surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. President Lincoln has been assassinated. This was a rather inconsequential battle. The picture here you see is Lieutenant E.L. Stevens of the 54th. In the skirmish, he was killed, distinguishing him as the last Federal officer to die during the Civil War. The 54th returned to Boston under great fanfare. Thousands lined the streets to see them return, much the same way as they had left. And obviously the picture you see is a reenactment. Now, people also forget about the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. It was organized at Camp Meigs as well, from the autumn of 1863 until the spring of 1864. So they were in action, they were in the Army, only for less than a year. The commander was Henry Sturgis Russell, who was the first cousin to Colonel Shaw of the 54th. Once they completed their training, they were assigned to the defense of Washington. After only a few days in Washington, they were equipped as infantry. They were told they'd be equipped as cavalry. They were equipped as infantry, and they actually fought at the siege of Petersburg, specifically at Baylor's Farm, where they acquitted themselves very well. After that, they moved to Point Lookout, Maryland, until March of 1865, when their only duty was to guard prisoners. Now, Richmond fell on April the 3rd, 1865. The 5th Cavalry was among the first federal troops to enter Richmond. They were eventually ordered to Texas and Clarksville because there was a little issue going on between Mexico and France with Emperor Maximilian. When that cooled down, they eventually returned to Massachusetts and were mustered out. There were many men who persevered. Stephen Atkins Swales was a waiter when he enlisted. He was eventually made a first lieutenant, commissioned, one of the first black officers to do so. Corporal John Gooding was captured on Lusty. He died at Andersonville. Andrew Jackson Smith, who you've heard. Peter Vogelsong enlisted at age 44. That was old back then. He was also commissioned as a first lieutenant. There are so many more who served gallantly, despite all the negatives that happened to their community. Without complaint, they served their country, they served gallantly, and they all became heroes. If you have any questions or any comments, if I can, I'd be happy to answer them for you. I also have a few books up here if you would like to purchase one. Questions?
I have a question about your first slide, Garrison, the abolitionist printer. Was he murdered in his print shop, destroyed?
No, he was not. He survived the war.
How was he?
You're probably thinking of a minister in Alton, Illinois, who was named Elijah Lovejoy. His print shop was destroyed. He was killed, and his print shop was destroyed in fire.
Yes.
What else?
Had Shaw been married? Did he leave any direct descendants?
Yes, he was married. He actually was married about 2 months before he went into battle, and he did not have children. He had siblings, a sister it was her descendants who found his sword. There's a great book called Blue-Eyed Child of Fortune. It contains the letters of Colonel Shaw throughout the Civil War, and many of those are to his wife, Annie. Her name was Annie Haggerty. Others? Yes.
The 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, when they were transferred to Texas, were they still infantry?
They were cavalry. They became cavalry when they had their duty guarding prisoners. They were officially cavalry at that point. They had gotten their horses at that point. Actually, they got their horses first, then they had to give them up and be equipped as infantry. Well, I thank you for your attention. If you'd like to know anything else, feel free to come. I'll be here for a little bit. If you want to see a book, I'll be up here for a little bit. So thank you.